It was a Tuesday evening in late October, and I was sitting at my kitchen table in Columbus, Ohio, eating reheated beef stew and watching the news with the volume too low to really hear anything. That's just how I am now. The house feels different when it's quiet, but I've learned to live with different. I'm 63 years old. I worked 31 years as a master electrician, licensed, bonded, built a reputation in this city that took me 2 decades to earn. I never had much handed to me. My father was a postal worker who fixed everything himself because there was no money to call anyone else, and I learned the same way. Watch, try, fail, try again. By the time I retired, I had a paid-off house, a modest savings account, a truck I owned outright, and a workshop in the garage that I loved more than most things in my life. I also had my son. His name is Miles. He's 31 now. I raised him alone after his mother passed when he was 9, pancreatic cancer, fast and cruel, the way that disease always is. It was just the 2 of us after that. I coached his Little League team. I drove him to SAT prep on Saturday mornings. I helped him move into his college dorm with a rented pickup and 2 trips up 4 flights of stairs. I was at every graduation. I was at every moment that mattered, and I was proud of that. I still am, even now, even after everything. He met Amber 3 years ago. She's from Connecticut, old money, the kind that doesn't talk about money but makes sure you feel it. Her father is a real estate developer. Her mother sits on the boards of 2 nonprofits and wears clothes that look simple but cost more than my monthly utilities. When Miles first brought her home for Thanksgiving, she looked around my kitchen and smiled the way people smile when they're trying very hard not to say what they're actually thinking. I told myself I was imagining it. I tried. I really did. I learned how she liked her coffee. I asked about her graduate degree, her thesis, her opinions on things I knew nothing about. I bought nicer wine when she came over. I stopped wearing my work shirts at the dinner table. I made every accommodation a man can make without losing himself entirely, and still, something between us never settled. There was always a current of something just below the surface. Politeness stretched tight over something colder. Miles started changing slowly, the way they always do, not all at once, but in small degrees, like a dial being turned so gradually you don't notice until the station is completely different. He stopped calling on Sunday evenings the way he used to. He started canceling plans with vague explanations. He became careful around me in a way he'd never been before, measuring his words, keeping things surface level. I told myself it was just adulthood, just a man building a new life. I had read enough to know that sons grow away from their fathers. I thought I was prepared for that. What I was not prepared for was the morning he told me he needed help paying for the wedding. We were at my kitchen table, same one I'm sitting at now, and he laid it all out. The venue he and Amber had chosen was a renovated barn outside of Granville. Beautiful place, I'll give them that, and the cost was substantial. Catering, flowers, photographer, rehearsal dinner, the whole production. He had a number, $42,000. That was his ask. His contribution toward the wedding that he and Amber had already planned, in a place they had already booked, with vendors they had already contacted. He presented it to me like a business proposal, calm and rehearsed, and I sat there with my coffee getting cold, and I thought about all the overtime I had worked in the 1990s, about the winter I fixed furnaces for 16 hours a day to keep the lights on when Miles was in middle school. And I said yes, because he was my son, because I thought that's what fathers did. I didn't think to ask why Amber's parents weren't contributing. I should have. I should have asked that immediately, out loud, and waited for an answer. But I didn't want to seem petty. I didn't want to be the father who made his son's engagement into a negotiation. So I said yes, and I transferred the first installment 3 weeks later. Over the next 8 months, I transferred money 4 separate times. There was always a reason. The caterer needed a larger deposit than expected. The florist they'd originally booked fell through, and the replacement cost more. The rehearsal dinner venue had a new minimum. Each time, Miles would call with a careful voice and a number, and each time I said yes. By the end of spring, I had given $48,000 toward a wedding I was told would be the happiest day of my son's life. I told myself the investment was worth it. I believed that. What I did not know, what I would not know for some time, was that during those same months, things inside my house had been changing. Miles and Amber had been staying with me periodically while their apartment lease was being renegotiated. I thought nothing of it. This was my son's childhood home. He knew where everything was. I trusted him completely, the way you trust someone you raised. That kind of trust doesn't come with an audit. I was away for 3 weeks in May, helping my college friend at his place in Michigan after a health scare. I came home on a Friday afternoon, set my bag down, and started walking through the house the way you do after you've been away, just checking, just the habit of a man who lives alone. The wall in the living room looked wrong. There's a painting that is hung on that wall since Miles was 12 years old. I bought it at an estate sale from an old woman in Bexley, a landscape of the Ohio River in autumn, warm ochres and deep browns, nothing famous, but I had loved it for 20 years, and it was mine. It was gone. There was a slightly lighter rectangle on the wall where it had been. I stood there for a long time. Then I went to the cabinet in the den where I keep a cedar box that belonged to my mother. Inside that box were her pearl earrings, a small gold bracelet, and her wristwatch, a Bulova from the 1960s that my father had given her on their anniversary. I had kept those things for 15 years, through 2 moves and a house fire that nearly took the garage. That cabinet was closed. I opened it anyway. The cedar box was there. The earrings were not. The bracelet was not. The wristwatch was not. I sat down on the floor of the den, and I did not move for a while. I am not the kind of man who cries easily. I have buried my wife, buried my mother, buried 2 friends. I know grief. What I felt sitting on that floor was not exactly grief. It was something that sits just beside grief, something colder. I went through the house methodically after that, the way you go through a job site after something's gone wrong, not panicking, just accounting for what's there and what isn't. A set of old coin collection books my father had left me, gone. A small silver frame with a photo of my wife holding Miles the day he came home from the hospital, gone. Not the photo. They'd taken the frame but left the photo on the shelf, which somehow made it worse. I called Miles. He didn't answer. I left a message that was calmer than I felt. I called again the next morning. He answered on the 4th ring, and his voice was careful in a way that told me he already knew what I was calling about. He said the painting had been in storage at his apartment, that he'd moved it for safekeeping while he thought I was staying longer in Michigan. He said the jewelry situation was a misunderstanding. He was sorry about the frame. He used the word miscommunication twice. I did not argue. I wrote down what he said, word for word, on a legal pad. Then I drove to 3 pawn shops over 2 days. I found the Bulova at the second one. The owner showed me the transaction record when I explained the situation. The name on the slip was not Miles. It was Amber. I stood at that counter for a long moment, looking at my mother's watch in a glass case next to someone's old class ring. I bought it back, $210. I paid it and I took it home and I put it in my truck's glove compartment because somehow I didn't trust the house anymore. And that realization that I did not trust my own house sat in my chest like a stone. The wedding was scheduled for the 2nd Saturday in September. In late July, I got a text from Miles. I remember where I was, in the workshop, sanding down a cabinet door I was refinishing for a neighbor. My phone was on the workbench, and I looked down at it and read the message twice before I moved at all. Dad, Amber and I have talked about this a lot. The wedding is going to be stressful enough, and we both want to keep the energy positive. She's not comfortable with you being there. I know that's hard to hear, and I'm sorry. We think it's best if you don't come. We love you. We love you. I set the sandpaper down. I put the phone in my pocket. I went inside and I sat at the kitchen table and I looked at the wall where the painting used to be, and I thought about my wife and about the boy I raised alone and about 31 years of work and 28 years of trying to be everything a father is supposed to be. Then I opened my laptop. I called my attorney the next morning, a man I'd worked with for years on property matters, and I told him what I needed. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Give me until Thursday." I said, "Fine." While I waited, I spent 2 days going to records. I found every transfer, every deposit, every text and email confirming the wedding expenses. I printed them. I organized them in a manila folder. I am an electrician. Documentation is survival in my line of work. You keep records of everything because the moment something goes wrong, the person without paperwork loses. I also called a locksmith. I had the locks rekeyed on a Wednesday afternoon, professional grade, and I gave the new keys only to myself. Miles had a key to this house. He had had a key to this house. He had had a key to this house since he was 16 years old. That key no longer worked. Thursday came. My attorney called. We talked for 40 minutes. On Friday morning, I drove to my bank and I sat down with the branch manager, a woman I'd known for 11 years. I told her what I needed to do. She was professional and efficient, and only once did she pause and look at me and say, quietly, "Are you sure?" I said I was sure. She nodded and we proceeded. I removed Miles as the beneficiary on my savings account and my life insurance policy. I am not a wealthy man, but I have been careful, and those accounts represent 30 years of careful. I redirected them to a charitable foundation that supports apprenticeship programs for young electricians, something I had been meaning to do for years, if I'm being honest. It felt right. I contacted the wedding venue. I explained that I was the financing party for the event and that I was withdrawing my support. The venue manager was apologetic and professional. There was a cancellation fee for this late in the process. I paid it myself rather than leave the vendor stranded. It was the right thing to do. I am not trying to hurt people who had nothing to do with this. I reached out to the florist, the caterer, the photographer. Same conversation each time. Some were understanding. One was frustrated. I gave each of them as much notice as I could, and I paid the cancellation fees that were my contractual responsibility. When the dust settled, I had spent roughly $4,000 unwinding commitments. I thought about that number. I thought about $48,000. I thought about my mother's Bulova sitting in a pawn shop case. $4,000 felt entirely reasonable. I did not call Miles. I did not send a letter. I did not write a long message explaining my reasoning or asking for acknowledgement or waiting for an apology that would come shaped like a justification. I had learned in 6 decades that some conversations have already been decided before they begin. He made his decision in that text message. I made mine at the bank. I packed a bag that weekend and drove up to Michigan to see my friend, the one I'd helped in May. He lives on a small lake north of Traverse City. I told him what had happened. We sat on his back porch for a long time without saying much. He handed me a beer and said, "You did what you had to do." That was enough. I stayed for 10 days. I fished in the mornings. I slept without the television on for the first time in months. I called no one, and no one called me, and I let the silence settle around me the way you let a room air out after something's been burning. I came home on a Sunday. The house was exactly as I'd left it, which sounds like a small thing, but wasn't. Miles called that Tuesday. I let it go to voicemail. He called again Wednesday and Thursday. The messages started formal and escalated. The first was measured. The second had an edge to it. The third, the one he left on Thursday evening, His voice was different, not angry, something closer to scared. He said things had fallen apart. He said Amber's parents had declined to step in. He said the vendors were asking questions. He said he needed to talk. I listened to all three messages in a row, sitting in my workshop with the lights on and the garage door closed, and I thought about what I wanted to say. I thought about it for a long time. Then I put the phone down and I went back to the cabinet door I'd been refinishing the day I got his text. I picked up where I left off. There is a specific kind of grief that comes from loving someone and watching that love be mistaken for an obligation. I had carried my son since the day his mother died. I carried him through his grief and mine simultaneously, which is a particular kind of weight that most people cannot understand unless they've done it. I did not carry him because I expected repayment. I carried him because he was mine and I loved him, and that is the entire reason. But love does not mean you stand in a room where you are not wanted. Love does not mean you fund a life that has been built in conscious disregard of you. Love does not mean you let someone take your mother's watch to a pawn shop and call it a miscommunication. I called Miles back on a Friday, 10 days after those voicemails. I kept the conversation short. I told him I was well. I told him I had made some decisions regarding my finances and my estate, and that my attorney would be in touch with formal documentation. I told him I wished him well. He started to interrupt, and I said calmly that I wasn't finished. He went quiet. I told him that I had loved being his father and that I still loved him, and that I hoped he would, in time, understand what I had done and why. Then I said goodbye. He said, "Dad, wait." I said, "Take care of yourself, Miles." And I hung up. The cabinet door came out beautifully. Smooth grain, even stain, hardware that fits perfectly. My neighbor picked it up on a Saturday morning and said it looked like it belonged in a magazine. I thanked her. After she left, I stood in the workshop for a while, looking at the light coming through the high windows the way it does in late October. That particular quality of afternoon light that makes everything look like it's being seen for the last time and the first time simultaneously. I am 63 years old. I have my house, my truck, my workshop, and my mother's Belova in the glove compartment. I have a friend on a lake in Michigan who hands me a beer and doesn't need me to explain myself. I have the work of my hands, which has always been the thing I trusted most. I don't know what happens next with my son. I don't know if he comes back around, if he figures out what he lost, if the marriage goes the way those marriages tend to go. I have stopped trying to predict those things. I learned a long time ago that the future doesn't consult you before it arrives. What I know is this. I woke up on a Wednesday morning last week and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the backyard, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt like the house was mine again. Fully, completely mine. No current under the surface, no door I was afraid to open. Just a man and his coffee and a quiet house in Columbus that he built and paid for and earned. That was enough. For the first time in a long while, it was more than enough. There's a moment, somewhere in the middle of all of it, that I keep coming back to. Not the text message, not the bank, not even the pawn shop receipt with Amber's name on it. It's the lighter rectangle on the living room wall where the painting used to hang. That's the image that stayed. I think about what it takes for a person to lift something off a wall that doesn't belong to them, carry it out the front door, and never mention it. The casualness of it. You don't do something like that in a moment of desperation. You do it when you've decided, somewhere underneath everything, that the person who owns that painting doesn't really matter. That's not a mistake. That's a conclusion someone reached over time. And I have to be honest with myself about my role in that. I gave Miles everything he asked for without ever requiring him to earn any of it, to account for any of it, or even to say thank you in a way that cost him anything. I paid for the car. I paid for the wedding. I kept the door open long after the evidence told me I should look at what was walking through it. I told myself that was love, and part of it was, but part of it was something else, an avoidance of the harder conversation, a preference for peace over clarity. That's on me. What I understand now, having had a lot of quiet mornings to think about it, is that real love requires you to see clearly, not harshly, not coldly, but clearly. When you refuse to see what's actually in front of you because seeing it would be painful, you're not protecting the other person. You're protecting yourself from the discomfort of knowing. Miles needed a father who saw him, who looked at the pattern of his behavior and said something true about it, out loud, years before it got to this point. I gave him comfort instead of honesty, and comfort without honesty is its own kind of failure. The decisions I made, the attorney, the bank, the locksmith, the calls to the vendors, those weren't revenge. I want to be clear about that, at least to myself. Revenge is emotional. What I did was a reckoning. There's a difference. Revenge wants the other person to suffer. A reckoning just insists that actions have weight, that what you take from someone has a cost, that you cannot fund a life built on disregard and call it love. I simply stopped pretending otherwise. What carries you through something like this isn't anger. Anger burns fast and leaves you cold. What carries you through is knowing who you are when no one is watching, the work ethic you built over 30 years, the integrity you kept, even when it would have been easier not to, the ability to sit with a hard thing and not collapse under it. Those qualities don't come from nowhere. They come from choices made quietly over a long time. Miles had access to every lesson I could have taught him about those things. What he did with them was his own decision. I don't know where he is right now. I don't know what he told Amber, or what she told him, or how they're managing the wreckage of a wedding that existed mostly on credit and expectation. I find that I don't need to know. What I know is that I woke up this morning, made my coffee, and stood at the kitchen window for a while watching the backyard go gold in the light. My mother's Belova is on my wrist today, first time I've worn it in years. That felt right.